Who is a recruiter and what do they do?
A recruiter is someone who basically recruits talent for either an organization or potentially a client. This can fall across either a corporate recruiter that works directly for an organization or a what we call headhunter, or basically someone that works for a client but is directly represents a recruiting agency.
Starting from your early life, could you share some experiences and interests that influenced you to pick this profession?
I would say being a recruiter, it definitely requires a hardworking nature. I grew up playing sports. I ended up playing, college or soccer in university. My dad was also a recruiter for a telecommunications company that actually did a lot of interpretation across the world. And so he was a recruiting manager there. And then he provided me that insight about, as I was going through my business career, potentially looking into recruiting.
You got your double major in business management and marketing at Lasalle University in Massachusetts. How was that experience?
It was a great experience. I originally started as a business management major solely. And then throughout my time, a lot of the marketing courses actually overlapped. And so what I ended up doing is taking an additional major, which required taking about 5 to 6 classes a semester for about 3 years. And what it really involved was different aspects such as, organizational leadership, human resource management, and really covering the various aspects of business. Through the marketing portion, it was a lot more focused on sales and marketing and really kind of driving customer success or customer attention. And so a lot of my courses really focused on that. Additionally, I also enrolled in the honors program alongside that as well to be able to kind of add additional courses as well.
And what does that mean?
Essentially, it required taking additional courses. This, often entailed so for example, the economics, there was basically 1.0 and 2.0. I ended up taking an additional 2.0 to meet that honors requirement. I also had to maintain a certain GPA of a 3.6 or 3.7 throughout my whole career at LaSalle.
Were there any interesting internships that you had during your study time?
Absolutely. So I had 2 internships that were specifically influential. My first was at Medtronic, where I was focused solely on the compensation metrics of basically a whole organization. Medtronic at the time was about 40,000 employees, maybe 50,000. And so the compensation team was about 5 people, and we were covering to make sure that all of the bonuses were going to be correct, for the end of the year payout across basically the whole global team. And so that was cool to really specialize within an HR focused function. Then when I moved to Raytheon, my human resources internship was a lot more holistic. So it covered compensation, learning and development, talent acquisition. And so instead of focusing on one specific thing, I had multiple tasks. And really, what was cool to me was working on the talent acquisition projects within that Raytheon internship. Now, like I mentioned, I did other parts of the human resources, but talent acquisition was the main focus that I really enjoyed and kind of propelled me even to moving into that talent acquisition going forward.
Could you share the experiences of you graduating and getting your first job?
So I graduated and I had already actually landed my first job. I graduated in May and I landed my first job April of 2016. And so I had actually gone through an interview process that took about 4 months. So I started in January. I had multiple interviews with my first company at the time, which was Healthcare Source. And there were some delays due to some budgeting and other types of just details that they had to work out. But by end of April, I had an official job offer to start 2 weeks after I graduated.
How did you find that job?
Yeah, I applied directly online using LinkedIn actually. And so submitted my resume directly through a LinkedIn job posting. The recruiter reached out to me. And then from that, I ended up getting the job.
Okay, what is it that you exactly do at that job?
So at Healthcare Source, I was a talent acquisition coordinator. So at the time, I was doing recruiting phone screens. I was also scheduling interviews for all of the offices for Healthcare Source throughout the country. I believe there are about 4 office locations as well. In addition, I would do some side projects. It was a smaller organization, about 250 to 300 individuals. And so basically, I covered a lot of the different talent acquisition responsibilities across the board.
Was that stressful for you?
Yes, it was really stressful because I was learning how to be a professional. I was learning to really work 40 hours a week, and that is just not for a temporary period. Versus internships, it's a limited amount of time. It's for a summer, a couple months. This was forever, and my work was going to continually be impacting over time. And so, I was there a year and a half, and I was able to see a lot of results from my work over time. But that came at a very stressful cost because we were a small company and our team was like 3 people.
How did you grow out of that job?
So I ended up getting recruited by Wayfair. So I got reached out to directly by them. They had an opening role for a basically entry level recruiter. And so what I ended up taking the interview. I had a screen with the initial recruiter and then the director of the org, and then I actually went on Wayfair's office campus, and then went through about 3 rounds and then got an offer.
So there you are. You're at Wayfair. What was it like?
Initially at Wayfair, it was very intimidating because now I was going from a team of 3 to about a team of 15. And so, there's obviously it's a lot more competitive because there are more recruiters, there are more positions. And additionally, I was hiring, for basically what we call specialized tech roles. And so this involved recruiting for app engineers, front-end engineers, QA analysts, R&D, really kind of the jobs that fell outside of the direct, full stack or back-end type of position.
And how did you prepare for that? You don't have a computer science background.
Yeah. Luckily at Healthcare Source, I had the opportunity to recruit on a couple different software engineering roles. So it helped that I had that background. However, I conducted an immense amount of research to actually learn about some of these specialized skill sets. So the technology differences between app engineering and front-end engineering versus full stack engineering, understanding the actual application of how these technical roles apply to the overall goal and landscape of Wayfair. And that took quite some time to ramp up. I would say probably 2 to 3 months, multiple conversations with candidates, understanding what Wayfair's environment required and wanted versus what was actually out on the market, and even knowing the questions to ask, which took a good amount of time, I would say.
Let's talk about your current role as a principal recruiter. How does a day look like?
So the day can vary, and it depends on how strong or how large the hiring load is. I would say in what I just described about being an entry-level recruiter to now being a principal recruiter, my role is a lot more strategic. And so now I'm thinking potentially outside of myself, but also kind of other teams of recruiters as well. So an example of that will be, actually helping contribute to the hiring strategy by providing market data. For example, if we want to hire a certain amount of engineers in this location, how realistic and feasible is that? How many of those engineers are actually aligned to the experience and the requirements that we want? Can we set realistic timelines? And so, what my day could look like is everything from the typical recruiting responsibilities, like talking to candidates, meeting with hiring managers, pulling, interviewing data. So basically pipeline funnel, how many candidates are actually getting through our processes. And so those are, some of the different type of recruiting aspects. And then outside of those responsibilities, I have different kind of mentorship. I mentor some of the other junior recruiters. I'm a part of various committees. along those lines. And so those are some of the other responsibilities outside of my daily role.
So, if you would outline, what is the main difference between a junior recruiter and a principal recruiter?
Yeah, so a principal or a junior recruiter is, I would say, the most aspects of their role are focused heavily on execution. So they are building the pipeline, really trying to basically find candidates for a role. A principal recruiter does that, but they're also strategic. A principal recruiter is thinking potentially 3 to 6 months ahead, right? An example of this would be, okay, let's say a specialized skill set has historically been harder to find. What can I do that the next time a role like this opens, what are some of the things that we could do to make sure that we can close this role faster? So what we do is we potentially pipeline some of these different positions and engage with a candidate. So this could be, reaching out through a tool that we call a CRM, or a customer relationship management system. And so what we'll do is we'll identify different candidates that meet our skill set of a potentially, highly coveted role. And we'll reach out to those candidates, even if we don't have a position necessarily open, right? But that's to engage them and say, hey, if a position does open at Wayfair, would you be interested? And so this is a lot more of a difference. Whereas a junior recruiter, they're focused on applications that come in, directly recruiting and speaking with candidates in the recruiter screens. They're less focused on the actual strategic aspects of the position.
What is it that you like most about Wayfair?
That I'm not the smartest person in the room. I genuinely feel that I have learned not just to be a recruiter, but to really learn strong business acumen, understanding how my position affects the overall baseline of a budget, or potentially, the financial implications, understanding that negotiation can really make a difference in, how an organization is structured, how my position can really make an impact to an organization by recruiting the right person for that. And I think being able to learn from a bunch of people that have done that, and being able to see how they've grown in their careers is really, really helpful, because I don't feel like I'm coming in with all the answers. And so I'm constantly learning new things. Every organization has its ups and downs. But I think at the same time, I've been there 6 years and I've learned a ton. I've learned how to, not only execute in a recruiting role, but also how to mentor people to, have them grow and take on more responsibility. I've learned how to work with senior leadership, executive leadership, and knowing what to even come to those meetings with. I've learned so many of these different, I think, business points of view that I think are really important to be able to make a professional successful. And I think what's been helpful is that my Wayfair development has developed me as not only a recruiter, but as a professional and business professional as well.
It is amazing to see how such a company as Wayfair is able to compete with giants like Amazon, Macy's, and other companies. How do you feel when you work in that environment? When you are outnumbered, but you're still performing a great job?
Yeah, I think the biggest part is what I had to learn early on was I initially wanted to fill every role as quickly as possible, right? I'm competitive. That's my nature. I think what I had to learn is there's a couple different things. I think one is what makes someone really good at their job in recruiting is someone that believes in what they're selling. And so if I believe that Wayfair is a great organization, if I believe that it's a place where someone can grow in their career, I'll be a lot better at my job. And so if I do that, then I can be competitive with someone that maybe has an offer from an Amazon, a Google, a Microsoft, right? Because I can pitch, hey, here's why I've been here for so long. Here's what I've seen. I think a lot of the success that I've seen, one of the things that's most fulfilling to me is when I see someone I've hired and seeing them get promoted multiple times, and they go from leading potentially, a team of 2 to now they're a director, right? The fulfillment that I get from that is so great that I maybe genuinely believe that our position is better than a position out there, and that allows me to be more convincing to a candidate. And I'll honestly, genuinely, if I don't think it's a fit for a candidate, I will tell them that. And I'll be honest, because what you don't want is someone that comes into an organization and then, it's not a fit for what they want, and you potentially could know that, right? If they don't like large teams, Wayfair is potentially not a fit because the teams are huge, right? Because it's a large engineering organization. And so if they've come from small companies their whole career and they're not necessarily interested in being in large teams, that might not necessarily be a culture fit. And so I think for me, it's the advice of being compelling because of what you actually believe in. And if you believe that this organization is going to help this person further their career and that it's a good alignment.
What is Wayfair for you?
That's a great question. I think I see Wayfair as an organization that leverages tech to meet its customer needs. And so, I think what a lot of people don't necessarily know is all of the background technology and the complexity that goes into Wayfair's operations. The technologies with their supply chain management of being able to get a item across the country in a couple days. The idea of using 3D or AR for a customer to be able to see what that product will look like in their home. I mean, that's not like very simplistic stuff. That's like solving very large scale and massive problems. And so I think being a part of that, it's cool being able to see that, and having directly recruited engineers that make that impact, I think is what makes it enjoyable for me.
It's great to have that sense of fulfillment when your job actually creates value, as you are getting people into the team that actually creates something. Do you have a sense of fulfillment every time you walk into your job and walk out of there?
I feel fulfilled in the sense that I like what I'm doing and that I feel challenged. I think naturally as a professional, you have your ups and downs, right? There are times when your job is harder to do, and there are times when it's, easier, or you're feeling like I'm in a great flow where things are going well, right? And so I think naturally there can be ups and downs with that, but I don't come into every day not wanting to work hard, right? I don't come in every day not wanting to give my best. I think that's something where I really try to do that consistently. Because one, I need to. I think I'm in a senior position, which requires me to be an example to others, right? It requires me to be able to set a landscape. I think also, as a Black man, I think I'm an example to others, even outside of Wayfair. They look at my career, they look at my title, they see the ways that I've grown, and I have to set an example of hard work and consistency is what gets you to these positions.
Speaking of challenges, let's talk about the details. You mentioned that there are ups and downs. What do you find is the most challenging in your job?
Not being able to control every variable. And what I mean by that is there are some times where we're, 75% through a process, or 75% through basically filling a role, and then the position has to pivot, or the details have to change, or maybe the location has to move, and it's completely outside of my control. That's tough, and you can't necessarily predict certain things. Another aspect is maybe you're at the end or the final stages with a candidate, and you think the deal or whatever, the position is going to be filled, and then a variable changes that you couldn't have seen, right? They're not necessarily willing to relocate. Potentially some catastrophic event comes up in their life that has to pivot them away from their job search. There's so many of these different things that happen that that I would say is the hardest part, because one, it can be discouraging, but two, as a person that is, I would say, obsessed with being proactive, when you have to be reactive to a situation, that can be really, really frustrating. And so I would say that's probably the hardest part, or one of the most challenging parts of my job.
How do you manage your time and prioritize tasks?
That's a great question. I try to use my early mornings to do deep work. So that's execution, that's any type of strategic type of thing. I find that my brain is the best functioning. I would say middle, so I would say past, 10:30, 10:30, 12:30, or, late afternoon. I try to have a lot more meetings during that time. I'd say I'm still fresh. I'm still able to actually contribute. It gives me times in the morning, early mornings, to prepare for some of those meetings, especially if I'm leading them. And then later on in the afternoon, that's a lot more catch up. That's going through emails. That's doing any types of administrative tasks that I need to complete. Unless, something is urgent, then I'll try to do that in the morning. But typically that's how I structure my day.
After lunch, brain fog.
I would say so. I mean, I think I would just say in the afternoon, if I'm starting recently, I was working, on basically hiring roles within India, which the start time was a lot earlier because they're 10 and a half hours ahead. My start time was earlier. And so by the time lunch hits, I've potentially already been working for 4 or 5 hours. And naturally that could make it harder for me to be focused by the time 3, 4 o'clock hits.
What are the key figures that you interact within the company on a regular basis?
What I like to call them are my cross-functional stakeholders. And typically I'll work with representatives within the talent acquisition organization. That's my direct manager, who's the associate director, and I'll also work with a lot of both individual contributing engineers as well as engineering directors. In the engineering director sense, I'm working with them on strategies, providing updates on the actual hiring progress, potentially any changes that need to be made, risks and vulnerabilities. And then for the individual contributors, I'm working with them to help develop an interview process, evaluating the effectiveness of our interview process. Are there any compromises? Is there anything that we should be considering going forward? How do we make it more scalable or leverage other types of technologies that the rest of the organization is using? So those are typically the types of stakeholders that I'm interacting with on a day-to-day basis.
What is the initial process of creating a job position?
I'll speak at least to it in Wayfair. Every organization is different. So basically that the role will come in from our engineering or senior engineering leadership, for an example. So that would be like the VP of engineering or one of the directors. They would come in, gets processed in our system, and then we'll actually set up an initial what we call intake meeting. An intake meeting is the recruiting team meeting with the hiring manager to understand the variables, details of the role. So this would be an example of some of the things that we'd want to know is where's the position located? What's the level? How quickly does this need to start? What are the technologies that this person is going to be using? How large of a team are they leading if they are in a leadership or management position? How many years of experience? So really getting into those nitty gritty details, and being able to actually start the recruiting process. And so typically coming from senior engineering leadership, they then inform the recruiting team. The recruiting team meets with the recruiting or with the hiring manager, and then we'll kick off the role.
Let's talk about the essentials. What is the difference between a resume and a CV?
So I'll speak to it in the United States because a CV and resume in Europe are actually pretty similar. Now, typically in the US, a CV would represent something that's a lot more focused, I would say, in academia or medical, whereas a resume can be used kind of for almost any type of job industry. I've worked actually with European clients, and they reference a resume pretty similarly to a CV. And so differences in America, a lot more academic focused or, a lot more, I guess, regulated industry focused. And then a resume can be used for any type of job industry. I would say in Europe and most of the rest of the world, it's pretty much the same.
So you've created your job posting and you're going to be screening multiple candidates. How do you define who is initially eligible for the position and who is not? Do you use any algorithms that assist you with that task?
Yep, great question. So there are a couple different approaches, and I think the approach depends on the type of role that we're looking at. So for example, in an entry level position, what can basically happen, is that you tend to get a lot more of those applications, or basically you tend to fill those roles directly through applications, right? So basically you put up a job posting, you use something what you call basically an ATS, or an applicant tracking system. That applicant tracking system is where the job description is actually stored and it's posted online. So you would see that position example on LinkedIn. If it was an entry level position, you basically would look through the applications. Now, typically in software engineering, I directly look at each resume. I don't tend to use algorithmic, I would say, focus things like remove resumes if it doesn't have this keyword. I tend to look at each resume. In some of the higher volume spaces, so for example, potentially, Wayfair has, warehousing, or, maybe Amazon or something like that. They might have an algorithm focused type of, like, I don't want to say resume remover, but basically like highlight these profiles that meet these requirements. In software engineering, at least for myself individually, I don't do that. I go through actually each resume and look at if the candidates are required. Now, typically what I'll do if I'm looking at that is I align. First, I want to see, do they actually have enough years of experience, right? So if the role requires 4 years of experience and they just graduated from university, I'm most likely not going to move forward with them, right? Second, I'm going to look at, do their technologies or specific experience align to what we're looking for? So if a role or a position is Java focused, I'm going to ideally look if the candidate has experience working within Java, in their current environment. Now, I think this is something that I don't want to say controversial, but I think is debated between the tech recruiting world, which is, does someone necessarily need to know the language to actually be qualified for the position, right? If someone knows maybe PHP, they could probably learn Java really, really quickly. Depending on the role, right, and how senior the role is will be, I think, determine the flexibility of that. And so, I'll typically look at, do the clients actually meet the years of experience? Does their technology skill set align with what the job description is looking for? And then also, is their environment comparable to Wayfair's environment? And so,
Could you elaborate on that?
So Wayfair's environment, I would say, is very fast paced. We're always trying to use technology to try to innovate. And so typically when you're in an e-commerce or maybe a website focused, you can try different things to see if it lands with customers or not. You could try different coloring on the web page or different things like that. In an industry potentially like, medicine or banking, it's a lot more regulated, right? And so technology use is not as, I would say, as fast paced or as quick. And so that doesn't necessarily dismiss that candidate, but it takes in consideration that, the speed of maybe an e-commerce organization is very different than the speed of a banking or a heavily regulated organization. So those are some of the things that I would consider whenever I'm looking at an application for a candidate.
Do you read cover letters?
I do not, personally, unless it's for...
No one does.
Yeah, very rarely. I would say I have, but I have found that typically the application level doesn't warrant, if I'm going through each resume and then I'm reading each cover letter, it just doesn't warrant the time, to be frank. Now, I do want to say that I would say in most circumstances, cover letters are not typically used. I would say, though, that sometimes smaller organizations or organizations that are very selective about the people that they hire do actually look for that stuff. This could be potentially like startup companies or maybe companies that are in Series B that are very focused on, does someone align with the culture of the organization? And every organization does that, but when you're at a massive scale or a larger company, you're not as focused on, being as selective. You're focused for qualified candidates.
You must get a lot of applications when you post a job posting, you said that you go for each one, but there may be even hundreds, if not thousands of applicants. How do you handle that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I'll work alongside, maybe if there's a ton of applications, I'll have, potentially another part of the recruiting team help me with it, right? So maybe we might switch off certain days. If I have enough candidates in the process, I might take down the job posting altogether just to help with the volume, and one, just to be transparent with candidates that like the position, even though it's open, we have potentially 10, 15 candidates in process. Like the likelihood of you coming in, there's already going to be people way ahead of you. So that's kind of how I would manage the load. I've never had to actually have thousands, luckily. I know some of my coworkers that have. But I definitely remember a couple times where I would wake up or come back after a weekend and it'd be like 120 applications, and it would take me, a good amount of time. So
Is it a priority for you to hire a person quicker, or do you usually wait for the right candidate?
that's the ultimate question that I think depends, right? I think you never just want to hire someone on quickness for the sake of quickness if they're not qualified for the position, right? I think one, it hurts your credibility as a recruiter. And two, it's not a great experience for the candidate or the hiring team. That being said, if maybe the hiring team is being overly selective, you might push back on the urgency of the position, right? So for example, maybe we've had 3 or 4 candidates that have been to the final stage of the process that have never got an offer. And we've been looking for a role for a long time. That's something where, hey, we probably want to have urgency to fill this role. And we've seen these several candidates come through, basically like, why is this happening, right? Is it that the expectations for the role are too high? Is it that, the recruiting team is not calibrated well enough? Is it that the need of the position is actually not what you initially thought it was, right? And so it kind of varies depending on, what the situation looks like.
Is a 1 to 2 page resume CV, in your opinion, is better than a 3-4?
Absolutely. I think, I don't want to say nobody will read a 3 to 4 page resume because that's not true, but typically you will not have someone read a full 3 to 4 page resume. I forget what the actual statistic is, but I'm pretty sure recruiters or just people in general, when they look at resumes, spend like 15 seconds on them or less. So to go through 4 pages and to read all of the details that are under each position, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get a great ROI.
In reality, people usually apply to multiple jobs at the same time. Let's say you have a candidate that applied to your company and is expecting for an answer from another company. Should that candidate mention that on the interview?
It depends where they are in the process. So, for example, if a candidate actually I'll step back. If the recruiter is proactive in their thinking, they'll ask the question before the candidate even has to disclose it, right? So one of the things that I do at the end of my screen or recruiter screen is I'll ask, what does your job search look like? Are you in process with any other companies? If so, where are you in the process with those companies?
How do you answer that question properly? Because that seems like a question with a trick inside. Because if you say, well, it's bad because I don't have much feedback from other companies, that may devalue the candidate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the other flip side of it is that you also, if you really like the candidate, you really want to move forward with them, right? And so, for example, you could say, and you could give a generic answer and have it be, say something along the lines of, yeah, I'm in process with a few other companies, but I'm in the beginning stages, or I'm in the middle stages, right? What middle and beginning are all relative to what a company does, right? Some companies are very formalized in their process. Other companies just add interviews as you go through the steps, right? And so you can be transparent in that sense. I will say, though, that if you have an offer from another company and your intent is to take it, I would be transparent about that, because what you don't want to do is waste the recruiter's time or the hiring team's time. Also, they're probably not going to be able to move you if their steps require 3-4 steps. They're probably not going to move you fast enough by the time the other company needs an answer. So that would be my recommendation personally.
Can a candidate ask how many steps are there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I usually provide that. I try to say, here's what the steps of the process look like, and go through each step. But yeah, I would actually recommend that you try to get that information to paint realistic expectations.
What if the candidate is very picky on finding a job and he hasn't applied to not even dozens of other jobs? Let's say he handpicked Wayfair and 1 or 2 other companies, and you ask him the question, how's your job search doing? Is it okay for him to say that I'm not widely searching, I'm just concentrated on you guys and a few companies? Is that okay to say? Will that devalue the candidate?
No, I think that's someone who's being strategic about their job search, right? I think a lot of people will say job searching is almost a full-time job, and it's somewhat true, because if you're in process with 8 different companies, each of them has an interview, you're talking hours. And then if you're trying to prepare for them, especially if you're in the technical space where it usually requires coding or some sort of like technical assessment, like I think that shows that that's a strategy. I think it's also, I would say, somewhat flattering if you're seeing that they specifically chose your company because they're interested in what they're doing, or they've heard good things and different things like that. So absolutely not. I don't think that will be held against them.
How do you define that the candidate is lying about some skills or traits?
That's a great question. So what I'll say, in a recruiter screen, in general, you can never 100% know, right? Because at the end of the day, if you've never seen them code, if you've never seen their work, if you've never seen them code live, or like have ever seen any of their work, there's nothing that you can do to actually verify that. A couple different things that I guess that we can do to try to prevent, or at least see if the candidate is being truthful, is we'll actually ask technical focused questions, right? So for example, with an engineering position, we might ask, in a design or app engineering, for example, we'll ask them to potentially explain what we call a design pattern, which is how you actually go up. What's the design pattern to actually create a mobile app? If that person can't explain it, you typically can figure out that they don't necessarily know what they're doing, or they don't have enough depth to it, right? And so we have some questions that can actually be precursors to allow us to be able to get insight into their technical understanding. Additionally, as well, you can also ask how they're actually what they're actually doing in their job to get enough information. If they can't explain to you in detail what their direct impact is, either to an overall team or an organization, that's an indicator right there that they potentially aren't qualified for the position, or potentially could be misleading you.
What are the other red flags that you can see in a candidate?
Talking very poorly about your current organization, even if you don't like it. Big red flag. It's one everyone, I won't say everyone, but most people have gone through jobs that they don't like. Most people have had terrible bosses, or, toxic work culture. You can say that without being, I would say, derogatory about it. For example, you could say, yeah, the environment that I'm in right now is just, I'm really looking to make a change. I've been there for some time, or it's not necessarily a fit for what I align to. But if you're outright saying it's terrible, and being very, very blunt, that I would say is somewhat of a red flag. I think I don't want to say this is like a red flag, but I will say that this will most likely dismiss someone from the later stages of a process, is if they can't provide examples and they can't actually speak to their experience. So for example, if I ask them, name a time when you've had to kind of disagree with a colleague, or like, how do you go about conflict? And they can't provide me a good example, or at least a decent example, that's going to be harder, because that question is going to be asked later on by, a hiring manager or someone else on the team. And if you can't provide specifics, it's most likely going to remove you from the interview process.
When candidates search for a job on LinkedIn, there is an algorithm that is embedded in the system that shows your potential match with a particular job through comparing your profile skills to the skills that are required by the job position. This leads to candidates trying to artificially meet the criteria of each job posting. There are actually a lot of videos on YouTube that encourage you to do that, to be on the top of the search. First question. Let's assume I find a job position, my skills don't match, but I filled them up, and now it's a 10 out of 10 match. Do you see the difference on your side if that candidate is going to be, let's say, more up than the other candidates, or does that make an actual difference for you? I mean, I do know you browse each candidate manually.
Right.
Yeah, we spoke about that, but I mean, system-wise, do candidates that have 100% match on skills or 80% match on skills are illustrated above the other candidates?
Yeah, I think it depends. Like I can't give you a definitive answer because like sometimes I can sniff that out. And what I would do for that is I could just say, okay, this person potentially just put all of these keywords directly to this job description, but like their actual work experience, when I look at what they were actually doing, doesn't necessarily align, right? So they could have, JavaScript on a React framework, Lever and Redux, and have all of these different things, but if their position doesn't align to like the actual story of what that like entails, I'm gonna sniff through that. Additionally, even let's say if I do move them forward and I get them on a phone call, and like I just said earlier about if you don't have examples of how you're actually applying your skills or what your actual impact is, I'm not going to move them forward. And so I think in a lot of ways, if an organization is strategic and good about their hiring, they have a lot of stop gaps or a lot of I don't want to say blockers, but like a lot of, I guess, checkpoints to see, does this person actually verify? Can this person actually verify what they're doing? It's one thing to just have a bunch of keywords, but if you're live coding and you don't know how to do it, like you're going to get exposed, right? Now it's harder with non-technical positions, right? So if you're thinking about, potentially a position in business or a position in marketing, marketing is within business, but, or something outside of like, directly testing skills and competencies, that's harder because someone could be a really good talker and they could provide all of these made up examples and be really, really good at interviewing, right? At that point, typically for more senior positions, you might have you might actually have case study interviews or hypotheticals, right, to see how can that person actually apply it in live time.
But system-wise, LinkedIn encourages you, if you have a premium account, it encourages you to add these skills to your profile to be a top applicant, quote. Does matching the skills of a particular job position actually make you a top applicant? Is there any difference from your perspective? Do you see that application differently than any other, system-wise?
No. Typically not. No. Now that could just be me, right? I mean, I'm experienced, right? So I know what an organization wants, right? If you're an entry-level recruiter, that might be a different story. You might not necessarily know everything, and that could be the case. For me personally, no.
I'm asking because from a point of view of a regular person who's searching for a job, if you are looking for a job, obviously you want to find a job, the system is encouraging you to match your skills to the job posting skills. And the line that is written there on LinkedIn is that become a top applicant. Somewhat hinting you that if you don't match your skills, they're not going to see your application if there's like 100 or 200 or more. Is that a case?
It varies by organization, and I understand LinkedIn's thinking behind it, right? If you come in and you don't have any of the technologies that's required on the job description, like you're right, you're going to get passed on. if you're potentially applying for a role at Google, a role at Microsoft, like I would not be surprised if they have filtering. I've never worked at those places, but I would not be surprised if they have filtering systems, right? Because they are such highly coveted roles, positions, organizations. So I could see it adding value, and I understand LinkedIn's mindset behind it. I think for me personally, like I said, being an experienced recruiter, and I actually, honestly, even going back, as an entry-level recruiter, I fell for that a lot. And I would actually look at that. I'm like, oh, this person has all of the skills or whatever. I talk to them on the phone. Their examples might be a little shaky. And I'm like, all right, I'm just going to move them forward because I know the technology. And then they would go through the interview process and not make it past the first round. And then it's like, you have 5 of those candidates. Like, how do I then look to the team, right? So I think, to answer your question, I think system, it depends the organization. I think when it comes to, I understand LinkedIn's thought process behind it. I will not say that it's the end all be all.
How do you prepare for an interview on your side?
Couple different things. I'll review the job description again, just to make sure especially if I'm recruiting for multiple positions at once. I'll review the job description. I'll review the candidates resume in advance, like 5-10 minutes before, and I'll come in actually with an understanding of like what I want to push on or like what I'd want to know. So for example, typically resumes don't really provide as much detail as like necessarily I would like, for example. So they'd be like, built accounting software for businesses. It's like, okay, so how many businesses, how many people are using this? Like I would want to know more. So I'll come into an interview already knowing what I want to ask. And sometimes, I'll go on the fly, or kind of similarly to this interview, you might ask follow-up questions as they provide you more information. But I'll usually look at the job description, look at the resume, and then from the resume, determine what types of follow-up questions I'll ask. I already have pre-created questions that are just general, but, I'll know what follow-ups I want to hint on.
What about cases of overstatements when you see a very polished, brushed up resume and you see that the person wrote there that he was saving the world every day, but actually it was not? How do you work with that?
That's a good question.
And should candidates be willing to brush up their resumes? Because there is 2 sides for this coin. You can try to oversell yourself. That's one way. And you can be honest, like, yeah, I did that, but I was not saving the world every day, but I did my job and I did it well. Which path would you think is correct to take?
It's a great question. I think as a person, it's important to distinguish your accomplishments within the position versus how you go about valuing how those accomplishments affect an organization or the world, right? So for example, I'm a recruiter. I've recruited and filled, well over 200 positions in my time, right? That is a real factual statement, right? I have actually done those things. I have accomplished that within my role. Now, if I were to go, on my resume, if I were to say, successfully recruited 200 plus engineers, changing the trajectory of their careers and lives, right? Well, maybe potentially that's in my point of view, right? But is that appropriate for a resume, right? Can I objectively defend that position in an interview? And is that relevant? No, right? In my opinion, right? And I would think for most people and most recruiting teams, it's not. What they want you to focus on, is what did you actually do in that position, and how were you able to actually execute within that? Because if you think about a position, if I open a position, I'm an organization, I am, in a sense, taking a risk by hiring someone I don't know, right? And so what I want to do is mitigate as much risk as possible when I'm trying to fill and hire a position, right? And so by providing more details in a resume, that gives me a lot more to ask in a recruiting, which reduces risk, right? Versus very generic statements and not necessarily qualified aspects.
So you're not looking for rockstar achievements in any candidate. And if people did not have those, they should not be making, well, not making those up, but making things too bright, I would say.
So I think here's the way I view it. It's less about what your accomplishments are. Like, I mean, accomplishments matter, right? If I'm looking for a director role and you haven't led a team of 15 or 10 or whatever plus people, like that's an accomplishment. It's also a requirement, right? But in a resume, for example, you could be working at the grocery store or be a UPS deliverer, right? And the way that you portray a position can be very true, but also said very differently, right? So an example, if you're a UPS driver, you could say deliver packages day to day, right? Or you could say delivering 150 plus packages between an 8-hour shift. I said the exact same thing. I provided two different numbers, but I provided what I was actually accomplishing during my 8-hour shift, right? That's very different than just delivering packages and boxes, right? And those differences are what's important to me, because then I can ask a follow-up question. I'm like, so with that 150 packages that you were delivering, did you have like deadlines on those? And like, how did you manage doing that in an 8-hour shift, right? Versus now I'm asking, so how many packages did you deliver on a day-to-day basis? Over what time period? Like, I don't even have to ask those questions anymore because I've already provided that information on my resume.
But there is a trade-off. If you apply for a job and you've done all these incredible achievements and performed so well, question number one, why are you looking for a job then? Can these statements devalue and work against the candidate?
I don't view it like that. And why I don't view it like that, you could just be looking for a change of pace, right? You could be looking for a new challenge, right? I think there's a lot of people that they acquire a lot of experience, or they acquire a lot of accomplishments, but they might want in a different environment, right? So an example, maybe you're in a large company, maybe you're a senior manager or an associate director, but you're not a director, right? You've accomplished a ton of things in your position as an associate director or a senior manager, but you still might be reporting into a director, right? And you might want that position, but that position is not open. And so you could potentially make a pivot to somewhere else where you're like, I'm looking to grow my career, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And honestly, I would say even if you're a good recruiter, depending on the reason, like, I'm not necessarily holding why you're looking for a job against you, right? I'm just trying to understand, are you qualified for the position and do you align with the needs of the organization, right? And so I think that, to answer your question, I think people pivoting that do that stuff, they could just be looking for a new challenge. They could be looking for growth. They could be their spouses wanting to pursue something. They're moving to a different place. So I think there's so many variables that you can say that I don't think that we can do that.
Is it okay to look for a job while you work at another company?
Yes.
Can that be a feeling of cheating some sort if you are talking to another company while you work somewhere else for a job position? How would you most correctly justify the reason for a person for transition from another job?
If you know that potentially there's going to be organizational changes that could potentially affect your job, I don't think there's any problem in you searching for a new job. If you're in a position where you're trying to make more ends meet for your family and trying to get raises, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, I think you have to be strategic in it, right? I think at the end of the day, you still have to accomplish what you're being paid for, right? I think that's just less of a more of a moral justification, right? But I think at the same time, I don't think it's wrong at all for someone to job seek, because I think at the same time, an organization can drop you, at any moment.
Do you look for charisma in candidates? How's that important?
It's a great question. It depends, and I think it depends the organization, and I think it's your definition of charisma, right? So, for an example, if I'm hiring for a director position, as a director, you're expected most likely to be able to publicly speak. You're expected most likely to have strong communication skills, right? If you don't have that, you're most likely not qualified for the role. Now, as someone who's a good communicator, potentially have really good charisma, yeah, the two probably are parallel to one another, right? But if someone is just a funny candidate, but they're not qualified, I'm not going to move forward with them solely because they're funny, right? And so I think it varies, and I think it depends the position. I think, let's say with an engineer, maybe a more of an execution-focused engineer, they might not be the best communicators, but they might know how to do things with technology that we just do not know how to do, right? I'm going to take that.
So the weight for knowing the technology for tech positions is more important than communication skills.
Not necessarily, because it depends the environment that you're in. And I think as you move up, communication becomes more important, right? I think, for example, if I'm even let's say someone going in the individual contributor path, they're what you call a staff engineer or an architect level engineer, right? They're potentially leading other junior developers. They're potentially leading initiatives that require them potentially to talk to non-technical stakeholders. You need to be pretty good at communication to be able to speak to someone that is in the business department and why they potentially have to justify giving you an additional $100,000 to drive this initiative, right? And so I would not say that technology leans on one side or another, right? I think as you get more specialized in roles, you could potentially take, maybe a little compromise. Okay, maybe this person's not the best communicator, but they can communicate enough and they know a skill set that is desired for us to accomplish things that we need.
How do you look at candidates who have previously transitioned from another industry?
Great question. I think for me, I look at a couple different things. I look at one, like what's the level of, I guess, quote, training that they got, right? So that could be anything from getting a master's in computer science, which is typically formalized education. That could be, self-taught, or that could be something like a boot camp, right? Those are typically the three ways that people make transitions out of a different industry, potentially in business into computer science or something like that, is typically through formal education, a boot camp, or actually being self-taught. The second part of what I look at is how have you actually applied it, right? So, typically a candidate that, if let's say they're coming out of a master's program, they have 2 internships, right? They've actually applied the learnings of what they're doing, right? If someone maybe, let's say, has a boot camp and they're coming out, or they're potentially self-taught, but they've worked on small business projects, right? Or they've helped maybe design websites for multiple small businesses and they have a portfolio that they can share. I can see, okay, you've actually applied what you're learning. You might have certain things that are, maybe a little, not, I guess, optimal per se when it comes to skills or maybe nuances in technology, but in general, you've actually applied it. The hardest part is when you're initially coming out, specifically, I will say with being self-taught and boot camps, and you don't have any type of application. That is what's harder, because basically what you're saying is the organization will need to take you on to really ramp you up before they see the return on your actual output as an individual. And so that's the way that I try to view it. Additionally, I would also look at how many years of experience after, right? So if, let's say, that person was in business 5 years ago, but they've been in software engineering in other environments for the last 5 years, they can be qualified for a position regardless of whether they went to a boot camp or they go into a master's program because they've already applied the actual learnings.
Is having a computer science degree important for a candidate for a software engineering position?
I think it is helpful, and I think it depends what type of engineering that you're doing. So, for example, a lot larger organizations, some including Wayfair, they will have algorithmic focused tests, right? And algorithms, are essentially, kind of like patterns or different things that an engineer would know to basically solve a specific type of problem using like computer engineer, computer science, like principles. Someone who's self-taught or potentially at a boot camp will have a harder time with those. And that if you have a computer science degree, you're going through that and you're learning in that type of mindset when you graduating or even going through your coursework. And so I have found that has tended to be, if you're looking for the kind of the larger organizations, that's the case. However, with other types of companies, maybe if you're like a UI engineer, right? So user interface engineer, you're focusing on building websites or how the customer interacts with the website or the user interacts with the website. You may not necessarily need that computer science background as much, right? Because the role and the requirements of the position do not necessarily need you to have that.
What if a candidate has no actual job experience or even internships in computer science field, but has a pretty impressive portfolio? Would you consider that candidate?
Yes, because they have application, right? So and we'll get to this, like when I'm working like on my career coaching stuff, when I'm working with clients and they're wanting to make a transition, specifically people trying to get into tech, one of the first things I say is go get a GitHub, right? Go show that you've created products and developed things. I said, you go to maybe your town center and go ask some businesses if they need help with updating their website or some technology. And then you can point that and then use that to go into an interview of like, hey, I haven't had my first job yet, but with what I have learned so far, here's what I've done to actually apply it and get my skills better.
What do you think about leak code and leak code problems for interviewing candidates? Being able to solve those problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. My friend actually just asked me this yesterday because he did a boot camp actually and transitioned out of marketing into being a software engineer. I think it depends what your aspirations are. If you are looking to get into the big companies, if you want to get into the FANG companies, the Facebook, the Amazons, or is it Meta now? So not Facebook or Meta, but those companies, like they're probably going to put you through a similar type of task.
Or they're going to put a whiteboard in front of you, give you a marker, and ask you to write a code.
They might. I mean, yeah, they might.
But you don't do that.
We do partially do that. We do something called a system design, where you're designing a system. So it could be, designing what the front end components or UI components look like. It depends the position, basically.
No, that's mostly a structure and architecture, but I mean like writing actual code on a whiteboard in front of people so that they could assess your knowledge.
Yep.
Do you do that?
We do that. We actually do it virtually. So we'll actually share like a coding pad that actually has, we use a technology called HackerRank, but we'll basically have a coding pad that actually shares where the interviewer and if you're the candidate can see.
The market, in my understanding, is not the best currently with all the layoffs from the big companies, the big tech companies. Me as a person who transitioned himself from business to computer science, I do feel that there is huge intensity in job applications and the competition. A lot of people are struggling to find jobs because of Because of the change in the market that happens after COVID, I guess that the tech companies overhired a lot, as they say they did. And there was a huge demand for boot camps and all those coding courses. The the thing is that people got caught a lot in the advertisement for, do you want 150K slash 200K a year for a job? Well, here's your entry. You just need to take this 5-month course and you're set. That's how people got, I'm not saying all, but partially got pulled into this. And then the market changed, and now everything is, I would say, shrinking a bit market wise. What would you say to those candidates who are striving to start anew as a software engineer now in this environment?
It's a great question. I think there are multiple paths, and I think it depends on what your goal and how fast you can quickly move. I think in my ideal situation, I think getting a master's degree, I think really helps, or a bachelor's, and actually getting, formal education really, really helps. Additionally, what it does is it exposes you to the alumni network of your university organization, which really, really helps. I think if you're not in that circumstance to take on the financial load, or, you're going into boot camps, the part about it is, as a job seeker, it's being willing to have realistic expectations and understanding that the huge pay raises and different things like that, those come with a amount of time that it takes to work, right? You have to work in positions. Your first 2-3 roles might not be positions that you necessarily want, but it allows you to gather the experience that you need to potentially make a leap. I think if, especially if you're self-taught, or you're going in the boot camp route, like having very realistic expectations that you might even have to take a pay cut potentially if you are passionate about remaining a technology professional.
Do you approach differently jobs that are remote and that are on site?
Yeah. I don't, in my personal recruiting experience, I don't approach it differently. But I would say that, unfortunately, remote has become much more of a rarity now, as basically the economy has now. Basically, companies have a lot more leverage, and they can say whether a position, if it's open, whether it requires to them to be in the office or not. And so I think that has led to a lot of people who want remote roles having a really hard time finding them. And so while I wouldn't say my direct recruiting approach is that way, I think that when I look at the overall market, it absolutely has changed.
How do you address potential cultural or regional nuances when you are interviewing a candidate?
That's a great question. I recently definitely went through that when I was recruiting for roles in India, which is a completely different country, completely different culture. And I mean, I really leaned in with my counterparts that were actually in India to try to understand, different cultural nuances. These were things even of the types of organizations that, to recruit for were definitely different than the types of roles that are companies that we would hire for in the US. And so that's like a perfect example of how that would be very different in that case. When it comes to, I think different places throughout the US, I would say the technology scene is relatively the same in regards to people being qualified, but the expectations of a candidate could be very different depending on where they live. So for example, in San Francisco, right, or like the Bay Area, you're going to expect that the salaries are going to be higher, and you're going to expect that person probably has multiple job offers or is in the running with multiple companies because there are so many open positions there, right? Obviously, in this current market, it's reduced, but we'll say at the peak of kind of the COVID boom, it was very, very competitive, and a lot of candidates had a bunch of different, a bunch of things, going on at the same time.
Interviewing people for you is your job, but for other people, being interviewed and interviewing is not part of their regular life. So a lot of people may end up being nervous on interviews. Is that an indicator for you? Is that a red flag?
No, I wouldn't say it's a red flag. I think it's pretty normal to be nervous. I think, when I was interviewing at Wayfair, I was very, very nervous. I remember specifically sweating through my shirt, because I was so nervous, even though I was talking to candidates every single day. Because you're being put under a microscope. You don't know, especially if you're not prepared, you don't know the strategies. Or it's just something maybe you haven't done in a long time. If you've been at a position for 8, 9+ years and you haven't interviewed for a new position, it can be hard to speak to yourself. How much information do I need to present? How much should I tell? And then especially if you're not prepared, or you're interviewing for multiple positions, you could potentially get things mixed up. Of course, I think it's completely reasonable to be nervous, and I don't see it as a red flag. It really comes down to how are you overcoming that nervousness.
Have you ever had a candidate that surprised you during an interview? And what was that like?
I have had some candidates that were very, very arrogant, or just they didn't like what I had to say when it came to negotiation and just hung up the phone with me. I never heard from them again. I've had candidates that were supposed to start that didn't show up for their first day. I've also had candidates where they've cried on the phone because they were so grateful about me reaching out to them and filling a position. I remember one person specifically who had been laid off, and he had a family of 3 or 4, and he had been looking and looking, and I had happened to reach out to him on LinkedIn. He was able to actually land a job, and he was just so grateful for the position that he had. So I would say that was definitely surprising, because I was like, I actually feel like I changed someone's life, right? And he did all the work. But
Do situations like this motivate you?
for sure, I mean, absolutely. And I think it's funny. I remember seeing that person at the Christmas party, and their significant other was there, and he was like, "This is the guy that got me this job." She's like, "I'm so grateful for you." She gave me a hug. I was like, "Wow!" I feel like I know your family. So yeah, it absolutely motivates me.
So when you're interviewing software engineers for a particular role, do you ask any technical questions?
Yes.
How do you evaluate them on correctness if you're not software engineer yourself?
So that's where we'll partner with our, for example, individual contributor stakeholders. So I'll actually have them develop the questions, and they can provide us with an answer key, right? Of kind of what, if a candidate's answer aligns with, the basically desired answer.
When you're interviewing your candidates, you mentioned that building a GitHub repository, creating a profile for you is extremely important. Do you look at those before the interview or at the interview?
I do not, if the candidate has had already had actual job experience, right? I think in the context of the GitHub piece, I think it's more important if you're a person trying to make that transition and you don't have professional experience, right? At the end of the day, what a recruiting team is going to lean on is your professional experience and how you actually perform in the interview. But if you don't have that, then that's important to have that, kind of profile piece for me to be able to see, okay, what have you done with what you've learned?
With the evolution of large language models, in my opinion, coding and software engineering has changed drastically. I think that there has been a silent revolution that not many wish to talk about. Here's the reference. Large language models can, particularly ChatGPT, can through a code interpreter write code, which basically, in my opinion, eliminated a lot of junior software engineer jobs in many companies, because now you would need one somewhat or experienced software engineer plus a large language model to replace four junior developers. What is your take on large language models and the software engineering industry today? What do you think is this gonna be a game changer?
Yeah, it's a good question. Initially I'm like, I don't know. Naturally you can think of like, do I think it's going to lead to like the Terminator? No. But I think the utilization of this technology, I mean, it's going to forever, I think, change the landscape of the world for sure. Um, do I think that it completely replaces the software engineer? No, because it requires actioning and prompts, and it requires like, I think it doesn't have necessarily like problem solving abilities, right? Or even determining what a problem is, right? Per se, it's using it to potentially find you an answer, and that requires a human, like a human intake, right? Or a human perspective. And so I don't think it'll fully take over, but I think that, could I see 5-10 years from now someone being able to know how to use this? Absolutely. I mean, organizations will like, imagine how much time you save if you could write very, very clean code and you don't have to manually write it. I mean, you're saving hours and hours and thousands or millions of dollars of productivity, right? But you're still going to always have the human aspects of engineering, I think, as well. And not every company is necessarily going to adopt that either. I think very innovative companies, absolutely. Companies that are for profit, absolutely. Do I think a bank will do that? Probably not with proprietary information, right? Do I think a hospital or type of like medical focus or government focus? Probably not, right? Because you put that information in, it's now in that, in that landscape. So I don't necessarily know if it's going to completely take over, I think, the way that people do, but I definitely think it'll change the landscape of technology for sure.
I know this is not exactly your field, but a lot of people who are trying to enter the market of software engineering now are worried about this because it has become more complicated to go into the field with such competition from large language models. Even though I personally consider this a fantastic tool, it can create amazing things and you can be more productive and effective with it and so on. But the industry as of yet dictates that you have to have junior level experience at companies. But since the junior level functionality is partially replaced by large language models, this creates a higher competition for future candidates.
Yeah.
What would your opinion be, or maybe an advice for those people who are thinking of taking on a route into the world of software engineering?
That's a great question. So whenever I, like I mentioned before, kind of on the career coaching side, whenever someone tells me they want to potentially move in to like a different industry, my biggest thing that I ask for them is like, why? Like, are you actually passionate about this? I have a friend of mine who was actually a recruiter that turned into an engineer. This guy since high school was building hardware, like, game drives by himself. He was doing coding for fun. Like, he really enjoyed it, right? And I think, now he's, now a software engineer, like a lead, or mid-level or lead software engineer somewhere. And he's done really, really well for himself. But he has constantly been like innovating himself, and he cared more about like the actual technology and like being a software engineer versus what came with it. And so I think for people that are potentially making a transition because they're like, oh, it's just higher money or different things like that, if you go in and don't get an educated understanding of like what that job actually requires and what you would be interested in, you're going to struggle because you're going to have to persevere through potentially a, tumultuous, type of career before you land on something that's a lot more secure. Right. And I think too, what I think people in technology, like not all software engineering roles are created equal. Like I think a lot of people, they immediately think, oh, like you mentioned before, I'm going to get 150, 200K and just be all set. Like that's not necessarily true, right? Top organizations pay that, but there are other smaller organizations where, they're making potentially like, 90K or 100K or, 120, and they have like 8-9 years of experience. Now that's great money, but it's not necessarily in this like, oh, I'm an entry level person making 300, 250 or 200. And so I think for me, the biggest important is making an educated decision and actually understanding that and like really having a passion for it. Because I think if you have a passion for it or you want to use that, like that knowledge to potentially apply your passion, right? That makes it more worth it. And I think it'll be a lot more successful.
Let's run a little experiment. Let's say you have, I know this might not be your positions, but I just printed this out from Wayfair website. I took 2 positions. One is computer science related, the other one is business related. Since I'm a mix of both, we can briefly look through both of them. What you have there on your left is a download copy, PDF copy of my LinkedIn profile. And on the right, you have a resume. Let's start with the computer science, if you wish, position, which is entry-level machine learning engineer. Can you guide us through your thought process when you're looking at a profile? We don't need to go too deep into the details, but overall, with a wide brush, what are the things that are you looking for from a particular job position and the profile that is in front of you?
Yeah. So obviously the first bullet, right? The main requirement is you have to have a PhD or a master's degree, right? With at least 3 years of full-time work experience in a quantitative field, right? So that's immediately what I'm going to look at, right? If a person has something similar to that or it's comparable, I would potentially move them forward. If they have none of that experience, if like they're not enrolled in it at all, I'm going to dismiss their application. Must be returning to the course study, that makes sense. Then, proficient knowledge in structural programming language, like, Python or R. I imagine, there's probably some SQL. Oh yeah. In the 5th bullet, it has SQL here as well. And so I'm going to look to see if the resume has that type of technology on that in general. I would then look to see if that, like specifically with the work experience, if their previous work experience aligned to something that they were actually using, right? So let's say this candidate was at a small software company and they're in the process of getting their master's right now, or they left their current organization to go pursue a PhD full time in their master's. So that's what I would do initially looking through that. I would then look, so in the second bullet here, it says preferred qualifications, and then the second bullet under that is some familiar with regression and machine learning techniques, such as supervised or unsupervised learning, recommendation systems, reinforcement learning, and deep learning, etc. So I would look to see, do they have any type of relevant experience to that, right? And the reason I would do that is because let's say I'm talking to a candidate, I'm not just thinking about my conversation with them, I'm thinking about the hiring manager's conversation with them. I'm thinking about when they go through, maybe they're talking with a director or a senior manager and they're trying to explain something that they've done to that person, that person can ask a lot more in-depth questions than I could, right? So I would look for that experience as well. And then, one thing that's actually very underrated is the second to last bullet is ability to thrive in a dynamic environment where there can be degrees of ambiguity. That is, I would say, very underrated, and a lot of people don't necessarily think about. And what's important about this is like, what's the environment that they're in that they can be okay with dynamic change and pace, right? If you're not okay with change, Wayfair is not the place for you because it's just a very fast-paced organization and there's just change all the time. So those, like, if I'm going through this job description, like, all things considered, I definitely am mainly looking at the qualifications, and then I'll align it to kind of what the resume says.
Now, can we try with the business, with the business job position? So on your left, you have a printout of my LinkedIn. On the right, you have my resume. Mm-hmm. Where do you look first?
If this was a job application submitted, the resume. Okay. Yeah. Obviously the job description first, but yeah, I would definitely look at the resume. So what I would do first is, like I said, review it. So what you'll need here, they say a bachelor's plus 4 degrees of experience in finance, strategy, or software. MBA preferred. Previous experience in management, consulting, all that stuff. So I'll look at those and I'll look at that on your resume side. So I would see that you've been a founder and CEO of, the Midway Group, part-time project manager. And then I would look on the education side. Okay, master's degree in international business, managerial economics, okay. That meets most of the criteria of like, if none of that was on here, I'd probably dismiss the resume, right? Because I have to see if you're, once again, I'm not just thinking about my conversation with you, I'm thinking about your conversation. And if I talk to you, when I present the resume to the hiring manager, what they're going to see, right? And I have to put my mind in their minds, right? I have to think from their perspective. So that would be like kind of the first part of what I would do. What I would say, and this is a note just for people that, our resumes, I prefer bullet format versus kind of the paragraph format, because now I'm spending a lot of time. If let's say you're one of 50 applications, I'm spending a lot of time reading the paragraphs versus I just feel like bullet, it's just very, very easy to go through. So example, your top section here, you have, find, 10 custom GPT models. That's perfect, right? Because I can see it very clearly. This is what you did, this, things like that. When I'm reading through kind of an adjunct lecturer, now I'm like, okay, conducted courses. Like I'm spending a lot more time than I'd probably want to with that, right? So how would I view that? I potentially could unbiasedly hold that against you because I'm spending a lot more time trying to understand what you do and what you've done in your previous experience and aligning it to the job description. I'm trying to make as quick, I don't want to say as quick of a decision, that's not necessarily true, but I'm trying to make a quick decision on whether this is moving forward, because this means that I'm going to spend at least 30 minutes of my time, speaking to you, right? So, in general, does this resume meet some of the requirements potentially for this position? I think it's worth a conversation. Do I think that there are things that if a different recruiter was talking, they had a specific mind frame of like, this is what I'm expecting, or this hiring manager is very picky, like potentially they might dismiss the application, right? So that's my personal view on it, but that's how I go about it.
Can you see any red flags there? And as far as we've been talking, you haven't looked at the second page, the skills and the certifications and everything. Does that mean that on the pre-screen level, you don't look at them?
I wouldn't look at it as much. I honestly didn't know there was a second page. So I didn't realize that that there was something on the second side. And if it was virtual, I could just scroll.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I would see it.
Yeah.
So this would intrigue me more. The portfolios and projects would be interesting. One thing that's really important that, this is, once again, if this was virtual, I like that you have all the links here. Make sure they're hyperlinked, right? Makes things super easy when I click on it and I can go to the podcast or go to your LinkedIn profile or go to your GitHub repository. Like, that just makes it easy. Just think is making it as easy as possible. This stuff for potentially for the first role that I went over, the certification side, this wouldn't be as relevant to me for the strategic spending manager and sourcing procurement because it's a lot more technology, probably more technology focused than it's actually needed for the position. For the machine learning, this would be probably more interest. This would be something I'm more interested in.
But would that be a disadvantage if you have that on a business role? Because you're a tech company, and if a candidate has technical skills, even though he's looking for a business job, the understanding of how software works, is that a plus or a minus?
I don't know that I necessarily see it as a plus or it's nice to have, but it may not even be a requirement of the role, right? So it's like, is that really relevant or really adding a step up? Potentially not, right? Now, if you had found some ways that you had applied it, right, that aligned perfectly with this position, and that's like very clear on this resume, then that's a different story, right? I'm not necessarily seeing that on this, right? But I think that's where the application would make more sense.
Jumping back a bit to COVID, has COVID influenced your profession, influenced your job, and what did COVID change in your life?
I mean, on my job personally, when I've been at the same organization through COVID. I mean, everything went virtual, right? So we did all of our interviews virtually. We've continued to stay virtually, which in a lot of ways has saved costs because you're not flying out candidates and different things like that. But yeah, I would say that has really changed things. I think we had to, as Wayfair, we had to expand to other offices during COVID. And so, typically all of our technology positions were only in Boston. Now we've expanded to, Austin, San Francisco, Toronto. And so that has, naturally some of my stakeholders are across the country and, different time zones and, all of those different types of factors that come into it. Being on LinkedIn as a primary part of my job, I also felt like there was a need for more information because on just like recruiting processes and like understanding professionals and how professionals can basically like enhance their brand because so many people were getting furloughed. There was a ton of layoffs. It was just like so much uncertainty. So essentially I started creating basically free interview content, just leveraging my recruiting experience on LinkedIn. And then like, I would just like post this on my, terrible iPad camera. And, I would just post videos helping people to, do, basically learn how to interview, how to write a resume, different things like that. And then people basically started reaching out to me. Hey, can you help me with my resume? I'll give you $50 or $25. And it's like, sure. And so then I started basically doing that. And I was like, oh, I think I have something here of like, basically Intern has created a side career coaching business, helping really professionals build their brand. And that has been really, really cool. Being able to do that and being able to see and really help people like find jobs outside of just, my day to day, has been like a really, really cool part of, I would say, my growth, even just since COVID has happened.
Do you plan to expand that business?
I think I'm going to keep it on the side for now. I love my career and I love being a talent acquisition professional. And, I love what I do at Wayfair. And so I don't think I would take it, going forward. But I think it's something where I'm able to fulfill my passion, and being able to just really help people think more strategically about, landing their jobs and building their brands and such, or even just helping make a career pivot even, which, I've kind of built out, like, I have my kind of resume, LinkedIn cover letter, which is like more professional branding, but I also have like actual coaching stuff, which is like career advice, even how to search for a job where you're just, not just applying to a bunch of different applications, but you're actually networking with a purpose. Interview coaching, like how to actually execute on interviews, especially if it's been a while, even what examples to bring up. Like, there's so many nuances that, like, we don't get taught this in college or in high school. Like, you're not taught how to look for a job. It's all just kind of ambiguous in YouTube. And so being able to actually help people with that is, I think, really cool.
But there's a ton of material and content on YouTube that answer the questions, like you mentioned. Why would a person choose to take up a career coach instead of constantly browsing for answers on YouTube?
Because each situation is different, right? I think what doesn't, for example, if let's say I'm a 45-year-old man that's trying to make a career move, right? A YouTube channel can't answer me how is ageism going to affect my position in the market. What do I need to do to actually reach out to people? How do I even network effectively, potentially in my country or in my region or in a specific field or different things like that, right? Like, YouTube is, I think, a great, or just online resources in general, is a great wide net of casting. But if you have a lot of ambiguity in your situation, you might need someone to help you define, okay, what can I actually focus on? The biggest value that I found to add is when clients come to me and they're like, I have these transferable skills. I know I'm a great communicator. I know that I like to work hard, but I don't know how to use that for a position. And I don't even know like what positions would be available, right? And then in addition to that, it's also becoming, okay, if you, let's say you are really interested in this position, does it actually align with your values, right? And so if like, okay, maybe I really, I was in social work, but I'm looking to make a pay raise or something like that. Okay, is that other career that you're potentially interested in, does that actually create a pay raise, or is there actual growth in it, or is it just interesting because it's cool, right? Helping someone define that before they invest a bunch of time, potentially re-education, is so much better and like I think to me, such a worthwhile service versus like trying to navigate it on your own and then you're just bumping basically through the process.
Yeah, that kind of advice can be valuable for many people. I saw your article where you talk about conducting interviews at Wayfair, and particularly you mentioned using a method called S.T.A.R.
Yep.
Can you elaborate how you use this method?
Yeah. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. And essentially what it allows a candidate to do is break down a example so that it's concise. So it's concise, but it's also informed. So if I ask, for example, let's say I ask Alex, when you were at the Midway Group, how did you handle conflict? Right. And, maybe you could say, oh, well, I try to find a middle ground, or I try to, learn about, what I might be missing. Or if you were like, well, there was actually this situation where I was dealing, potentially with one of my employees that they were showing up late, that's the situation. I had tracked it, right? And I had actually taken a look at what was actually, how many times it had happened. And it was like 5 different times, over the course of 2 weeks, right? That's a task. And the action I took was first going and having a conversation with them, understanding why they're late. And it turned out that, the bus to get to where I was ended up failing, or it was no longer running. And so they had to take a alternate route and they were getting late to work consistently, right? That's the action you took. So what I did is we worked on adjusting their schedule where they would come in a half hour later and, they would stay a half hour later to try to accommodate that schedule. And it ended up working out. That would be the result. Now, I just made that up. That could have never happened. But the way that I first answered the question is how I would hypothetically do this versus how I actually did it makes a massive difference in an interview process. And that's something all my clients I work with, I teach them that, especially on the interview coaching side. I'd say like that is the bread and butter of effective interviewing.
What are the most important skills for someone to work in talent acquisition?
Strong, I think a hard work ethic for sure. It is definitely a grind. I would say that. I think um, being a strong communicator is really effective because you're going to be communicating with all types of individuals and all different types of positions and all different types of people. I would say being proactive and potentially seeing different types of problems that can arise so that it doesn't affect the ideal results that you're trying to achieve. Those are like three things that I can think of. And then also being collaborative, like being able to be a team player, being able to work with a bunch of different people, especially if you're dealing with different hiring managers or different candidates, or, you have to be able to be a collaborative partner, to others.
How do you evolve? How do you become a top professional as a recruiter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you my opinion because I think it varies person to person. I think for me, the biggest growth that I had to evolve in, I came in with an execution mindset when I first got into Wayfair, which I think at the time as a junior employee was the right mindset. What I had to learn was how to become a thinker outside of myself. This required being strategic in my thinking, like I said, about being proactive. I gave an example of like we're looking for a top skill set that can take forever to find. How do I prevent an extremely long search that puts the business at risk? Right? That's one area. I think being strategic. I think two, making others better around you. Right? If you are successful at something, it's important that you share it with others versus just keeping it in, because people will see that if you can teach others how to become a better professional and a better recruiter, you're going to become so much more valuable to an organization because you can make a team so much more efficient. So I think that's another thing. And then I think being able to, I think, adapt and grow with change. An example of this is adopting new technologies and new types of potentially, recruiting, I don't want to say practices, but recruiting processes that might be different from what you're used to. And being able to do that effectively, I think, is really important. So I would say those are a couple things that I think of.
Do you ever get bored with your job?
No, there are definitely slower times. I mean, when you're getting towards the end of the year, typically people are not getting back to you as quickly, or there are not as many positions open. So there are definitely slower times in the year. But with that, and that requires preparing for the next year. So I wouldn't say I get bored. No.
Could you highlight any high or low seasons for finding a job?
What do you mean by that?
Well, you mentioned that there are times when things go lower, things go higher. Does that relate to winter break or summer break or any other seasons? Is it seasonal?
Yeah, I think it's just the nature of at least corporate America and corporate settings. Like typically, companies' fiscal years begin or end between January and like March, right? And so if a company is ending in, getting towards the end of the year and their fiscal year starts in January, like they're probably through the majority of their budget, right? Maybe in November, December, right? And so their need to hire might be slowed down until they have a reacquainted budget into the new year. In the same way, on the other side is also like when candidates get back to you, like I'll notice in the summer, the interview processes take so much longer to schedule just because people are just on vacation, right? And similarly with the holidays, you get less applications because people are like, okay, when the fall hits, then I'm going to change the job. Or when I start in 2024, I'm going to make sure I get that next job. So I think that's kind of the ups and downs and the seasonality of hiring.
If you would look back into your life and you wish you knew something about this profession before you actually dived into it, are there things that you wish you knew earlier when you started out and not learned it the hard way?
Yeah, I would say definitely the volatility of recruiting. So if you think about when an economy is doing great, recruiting is probably one of the most important jobs, right? You get you become a very popular person because everyone is looking to hire people, right? And if you can find someone that knows how to hire good people, they are instrumental to the organization, and it's a lot of people capital. At the same time, if a company is not doing well and there's no goal of them hiring, most likely talent acquisition or recruiting is going to go first, right? And so that is a hard part of it, is like you really have to, you can be in the right circumstances where, the organization is doing fine, but there are other times where what we just saw with, COVID, where a ton of people get affected because organizations think they need to hire all these people and then they realize they don't, and so they're like, why do we still have a talent acquisition function, right? And so that, I think, is the hardest part that I didn't know going into it, where it's a lot of, like, I'd say, like, high risk, high reward in a sense, as well.
For those eager to start their career in talent acquisition, what advice would you offer, especially in today's evolving market?
I would first talk to two different people that are in that position and come in with questions about what their actual day-to-day is and challenges. I would then write out important values and what they value, right? Is it they want to be fast paced? Is it that they want to talk with people a lot and deal with different types of problems and being able to really make an impact in the organization, but understanding that it's the nature of ups and downs? Every job has ups and downs. Recruiting has a lot of emotional ups and downs because, you could have a position open for 5 months. You're about to close the candidate and then they decline and you're back to square one, right? Are you okay with that? That's a serious question you need to ask. Are you, so I would say for them is getting I would actually flip it. I would actually write down your values of what you care about, like, and what you're hoping for in your, kind of next position. And then after that, getting some, like, information of, like, what it actually looks like to be in talent acquisition. And similarly to software engineering, not all talent acquisition is created equal, right? Certain organizations leverage it very differently than others. I'm in a very fortunate spot where, like, talent acquisition is very much seen as a partner. And so, I'm really blessed in that area. But that's not the case everywhere, right? So that's what I would say.
Jonathan, thank you for your time and this very interesting conversation. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thank you. You as well.